I'm a member of the Communication Committee here at Columbia Yacht Club. The Communication Committee has a project going now where we're going to be interviewing interesting members of the club that we consider to be legacy members, and provide you, the membership, with the opportunity to get a little closer and get to know them more personally and hear their stories and their experiences of being members for so many years. Today, our first interview begins with Herman Ebner. It's an interesting story, and I hope you'll enjoy it. So let's start at the beginning. Do you remember when you first discovered the Columbia Yacht Club? Remember when you walked by or heard about it? What was that? Do you remember that event or that time?
Well, I think I was first introduced to the yacht club in the days of the old Florida by my then skipper. I was sitting in my office one day, a good friend, this was during the holidays at the end of the year, a good friend of mine walked in, announced to me that he had been at a party the weekend before and bought a half interest in a boat, and was I interested?
Oh, wow.
And I was. I was living on the South Shore, and I could watch the boats race out of Jackson Park. They were Olympic class sailboats, and I said, wow, that's terrific. So he said, well, yeah, I'm interested. So that was at the end of the year. So by spring, I was recruited again, and we went down to the boat yard. That was at Belmont and Clybourne.
Okay.
And my first job was sanding the boat's bottom. And I guess that's initiation fees. But
yeah.
And so I was recruited to be the foredeck on there. I was not a member of Columbia at the time, but they brought me here, and I looked. It was not here, of course. It was at at the other location and on the Florida. And I really liked it. So then we got to sailing, and on the foredeck. Now the boat we were on is a Tumlaren. There's a model of it, half hull in the bar. A Swedish design, built. The boat's name was Loki. It was part of a small group of One Designs that raced outside of the harbor. It had its own committee boat for One Designs. There were also dragons as well, and I guess the shields came later on. So I got indoctrinated in the foredeck. It was a 25-foot wooden boat, no lifelines, no self-draining cockpit, very wet, and I'm not much of a swimmer. I'm a sinker.
Oh, I like that line. Yeah, I can relate to that.
So we raced as a crew and a non-member for about 2 years, and then I decided I knew enough to take a partial charter from the owners, and I tried to develop my own crew. At that point, I joined the club by necessity as a regular member. Well, my second boat was a CNC 30.
Oh, wow. That's a big boat.
Named Maggie May. Actually named after a lady of ill repute that walked the docks in folk songs, English folk songs, in Liverpool.
That's interesting.
There was a song by Rod Stewart.
Wake up, Maggie,
Rod Stewart, Maggie.
Referring to, well, unbeknownst to anybody, streetwalker.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Well, and my first Mac was as a crewman on a 40-foot sloop. That was in the notorious 1970 Mac.
Oh,
Notorious because it was a full gale, 50 knots on the nose, and it was probably one of the roughest races on record here in Lake Michigan. Ted Turner was here with a 12-meter and was impressed.
I heard he didn't make it all the way.
I think he did.
Yeah.
A lot of boats did not.
Yeah.
We did not. We turned back. I was on a sloop named Bella,
Okay.
and by that time we had, of the 8 people, 3 people pretty seriously seasick, 2 people, including myself, and the other foredeck men who had already upchucked once. And so we were down, and we were taking on water. And the design was peculiar. It was kind of wine glass shaped, and the motor was down in the bilge, and it was underwater by the time we found it. It was a design characteristic of the Columbia 40 sloop. And with the sick people we had, and we had our big heavy jib. We were trying to take it down, got loose and went up on Hanks and was flying off the top of the mast like a banner.
You couldn't unroll it in those days.
Well,
yeah.
it's a long story, but it came down later of its own accord. But at that point, we called the Coast Guard, and they said, we'll meet you at Frankfurt Harbor.
Mm-hmm.
We don't go out in weather like this.
So you had to get in.
Yeah, so we sailed back under the Main, downwind, with a lot of oops. That was exciting.
That was an experience.
Yeah.
So a lot of people, I'm assuming, that are watching us now and hearing about the old stories of the Florida, they didn't experience the Florida, and I'm one of those people. How would you describe the Florida to someone who hasn't seen it? How would you describe your going on board, and what was it like? I mean, we know what the Abbey's like.
I have a great affection for the Florida.
Mm-hmm.
The bar, the dining room, the afterdeck, that had an awning on it, sitting under the awning and watching the boats in the harbor. It was much smaller than this facility,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah.
And our membership was smaller by a great deal. And it was possible to really know just about everybody at the club. It was much more of a community.
More intimate because it was closer.
Yeah, well, it was smaller in number. And it was almost exclusively a sailing activity-oriented club.
Okay.
Not as social as we are right now, although we had our social affairs as well.
So compared to the Abbey, what's some of the distinguishing features that set the Florida apart from the Abbey? It was smaller. Is there anything else that stands out?
The proximity to the boats in the harbor.
Okay.
The boats were all about. The harbor was at that point not filled, as it is not now filled.
Mm-hmm. All the boats then were on cans, and there was no slips like Gustavo today.
That's correct.
What do you miss about the Florida?
Basically being 30. Well, I was a novice at that point, and there were a lot of really expert sailors around,
Mm-hmm.
and the stories were flowing. Some very senior members at the time really remembered the old days of the Père Marquette. Ed Stein, Commodore Stein,
Yes.
was a member since 1937, and he joined as a junior. So he's 103 now, I think, and still going.
Wow. So when you joined, he had been on board for 30 years.
It was certainly very active, sailing-wise.
Mm-hmm.
There were one-design boats. There were boats that raced in all the big regattas. One famous boat, which I missed sailing, belonged to Commodore Rubinkamp. Was called the Rubaiyat, a model of which is in our our lobby,
Okay.
and which is you see on the cover of your menu is
Oh, yes.
it's
Black and white photo, yeah.
yeah, it's on that photograph which dates back to the 30s, I
Oh,
think.
wow. So what about the Florida do you not miss? Like, it's gone, I'm glad it's gone. What about it? Is there anything that you...
Well, as it turned out later, it was really quite a fragile ship. It was built out of Swedish steel. I think it was in Cleveland or something like that, and it had been in the World's Fair of 1933 as a tour boat, and I think we took it over about 1936 or something like that, if I remember. By that time, the engines had been taken out, the side wheels,
Yeah.
and it had been used as a scow. It still had some interior down below.
The history of the Florida includes the infamous galley fire, or kitchen fire,
In '55.
yeah, on a Friday the 13th, in fact. And the stories that I heard was that the ship had to be flooded, kind of like pull the plug to quickly put the fire out. And then when it was raised, the members had to initiate the project to get a whole new deck and a whole new housing for the gatherings, the dining, all of that. So,
That's essentially correct.
yeah.
The structure of the Florida was a steel hull, but the interior structure was wooden.
Okay, yeah.
And that was what caused them to sink it deliberately, to preserve the interior structure.
So on the Florida, when we talked about the Florida having to have been sunk because of the fire, that was the quickest way to put it out. Do you recall how they were able to get it back up?
Well, yeah, it was an interesting process. It took some ingenuity. Fran Byrne, who was managing that recovery project, I think he was a Commodore at that time, simply had plywood put around the water line, the deck, to extend the height of the bulkhead just a couple of feet. The Flora was sitting on the bottom at the time in mud, and so they plugged all the holes, the portholes, and any major gaps. They plugged all those and simply put a pump into it and pumped the water out, and slowly the boat came up.
Air replaced the water and it started lifting.
Yeah, on its own buoyancy.
Wow.
And it took a year or two to rebuild the superstructure, which was there when I joined the club. The ship had replaced the Père Marquette in the meantime. In 1926, I think, had been was also a steel hull, but with a wooden interior, and it had gotten enough dry rot to be really unusable. So they got permission from the Coast Guard, and it was towed out into Lake Michigan.
I heard it was off of Wilmette.
And off of Wilmette, it was set afire, loaded with coal oil. It burned down to the water line and wouldn't sink. So the Coast Guard had to come up and put some shells into it and sank the hulk up there. And apparently it's somewhere off of Wilmette.
It is, and I guess the divers know. But who would have thought that a boat fire would go out when it hits the water line? But yeah, that's an interesting story, and that story lives on.